Everybody has a handful of games that they grew up with that they hold near and dear, and despite quality will often defend and insist on playing after a few drinks. One of the games I always turn to with fondness is Duel Master, and no, not the crappy puzzle games published by Nintendo. Developed by Sega in 1991 for the Sega Mega Drive/Genesis, Duel Master starts you off with an opening prologue setting up the initial plot. As it turns out, there once, in an undetermined era of time, was a kingdom called Mythgard, depicted here as a desktop icon stretched to full screen, which resided peacefully until Geraldine the Mad turned up. And I haven't made that name up either, that is what he is officially known as, and what else would you call him? Look at him, the evil bastard. Anyway, Geraldine, as he will now be called, is leading his Dark Legion to destroy Mythgard for reasons never really explained, which subsequently results in the 12 elemental masters to come forward to try and stop him. There they are, look, a great bunch of lads. The only 4 to make it out of the battle alive though, mind you, although this one's face does seem to be melting into the scorched sky somewhat. The 4 remaining masters combine their power into the one ring, the Holy Blade, in preparation for the final battle, and it is up to you to save the day. I've never actually been 100% sure whether you're meant to play as one of the 4 remaining masters, or you're just some random bloke with a headband. Anyway, releases from 1991 aren't often critiqued for their storytelling abilities, so I will focus on what did matter back then, the game itself. This is a single-plane, side-scrolling action game, and as with games released prior to maybe the PlayStation era, this has one very unique mechanic that the game is based around that makes it stand out from other similar titles. The standout innovation here is the ability to choose which fingers you wear your jewels on, although really I think ring would have been a better word to use than jewel. Perhaps if Naughty Dog hadn't gotten in there first with Rings of Power, this game may have had a different name. Your arsenal starts small with a fire and water ring. The fire ring emits a short flame burst to damage opponents, and the water ring creates a barrier to soak up damage. Choosing which hand to equip each ring to dictates which of the A or B buttons on the control pad will activate each attack, and wearing 2 contrasting elements on the same hand, i.e. fire and water, will cancel the properties out, resulting in nothing happening. The first level of the game has you battling a strange array of land and aerial enemies, which range from pterodactyls, orcs to mudmen, in an environment which seems to be somewhat inspired by ancient Greek mythology. You can attack your enemies by firing up or straight ahead, and you also have a jump move. Before long, you will have fought and dispatched of a knight in armour who seems to have forgotten his sword and punches like a T-Rex, who drops your first additional ring representing the air element. Thankfully, and where the game starts getting interesting, this one can be combined with your starting rings, turning whichever one you choose into a projectile. From this point on, the game becomes a quest for rings, to discover which new and inventive types of weapons you can create by mix and matching. First levels in games often acted as kind of a tutorial, to get you used to the controls and level layouts, without ever explaining to you in actual words how the world you're playing in works, and as such can often be disregarded as a bit easy and throwaway, which is no exception here. Enemies are quite slow off the bat, and probably won't have a chance to get near you before a fireball sends them packing, all except this guy of course. And after a few minutes you will have discovered that the wave shot is a game changer as it can shoot for the ceiling, Santa exists and he upgrades your health, and that the boss fight doesn't take too long to get to. The boss fights in this game are a little bit strange and mostly revolve around some sort of animal. In this case it's a white tiger who, once you get the pattern down, is pretty easy to dispatch of. I bet you this footage would look quite stupid if it was sped up. The first level is certainly a bit flat and lackluster, but luckily from here the game picks up with more inventive and interesting levels, all revolving around different locations containing their own unique enemies. These worms in level 2 always reminded me of that sand snake from Beetlejuice for some reason. Also, unlike the first level, each stage is broken up into 3 parts to give them a bit more variation, the middle part usually being set inside and involving more platforming or slight puzzle solving. By puzzle solving, I mean discovering that you can do a high jump if you only equip the air ring. I think these indoor sections are the game's stronger point, as they are a little bit darker themed and can be somewhat maze-like, which gives more of a Castlevania sort of feeling to the game, whereas the outside sections feel more inspired by something like Alicia Dragon. As expected, the game does get harder with each level, and because of the ever increasing amount of rings you acquire, along with the locations, the combat never gets boring. As a spectacle though, the game can be hit and miss. Your character is the first misstep. I don't mind the design of him, and they have animated his enormous Chris Hoy legs fine, but from the midway point up, he is pretty much a static sprite. I never actually noticed before, but anything above his belt line never moves, with the exception of one sprite swap for the attack. The enemies are a little bit more animated, but they certainly are of an odd design. I mean, what is this? What is it? That thing genuinely used to scare me as a child. It's still pretty scary now looking at it. The level design is a bit all over the place, but somewhat consistently aesthetically pleasing. Each stage revolves loosely around a type of element and looks debatably on the one hand uninspired and the other artistically interesting. One place though the game doesn't falter in my opinion is with its music. Composed by Motoaki Takenushi, who would later go on to work on the Landstalker and Shining Force games, this is easily one of my favourite 16-bit soundtracks. And yes, it did take a few attempts to pronounce that bloke's name. Each track is completely different in tone and really adds to the mood of each level, whether it be fast and frantic, or cold and slightly depressing. It just fits and only gets better as the stages go on. Speaking of the stages going on, the game only has 5 levels, but with the exception of the first level, they're quite long. I think I clocked in around 45 minutes total completion time, but that was with dying twice on this big bugger. Who conveniently brings me onto the topic of the end game. Defeating Mr. Dragon here will drop the last of our fully powered up rings, there being 3 levels per 4 elements, and acquiring this will allow you to access the best weapon in the game. A weapon which, if you're like me when you're little and would skip every starting screen to get right into the game, I had no idea existed, resulting in many failed attempts when it came to fighting Geraldine. Up to this point, we were safe in the knowledge that elements that conflict each other result in nothing happening when being worn on the same hand. That is of course unless they are all of the same sort of dog shit shape, in which case they transform into gaming's worst looking sword. And no, I haven't photoshopped out the pixels. This just looks awful. It's just a shape where colour should be. Did they forget to draw it, or did they just run out of time? Either way, it's somewhat of a letdown. I remember when I first discovered it thinking that I had unlocked some sort of cheat, and that it was a secret weapon, which perhaps it is, but I shouldn't have thought they would have included it in the opening scene if that was the case. Anyway, Blade, as it is called, fires a massive projectile which is super overpowered and can fly through walls, the only downside being that you can't aim up, which isn't too much of a big deal really. Getting beyond that, after travelling through many different lands, caves and structures, we finally come to Geraldine's castle, which is heavily Castlevania inspired, and all the better for it. This final stage also adheres to the 3-part structure, however has an odd shift in mood in the middle. The first part is sort of calm and brooding with not many enemies, then part 2 throws in funky upbeat music and wall puzzles. After this we are met with a horror inspired end level, and this final stage actually does a pretty good job at building tension. There aren't any enemies in this stage other than 4 statues representative of the 4 elements, and the walk from one end to the other and to the top takes quite a while. But when we do reach the top, we know we're in for the amazing sword battle we've been hoping for all this time. That would be the case if Geraldine actually moved, rather than just slowly changing colour and then turning into a Terminator head that shits out a ball at you. Defeat the old bearded bloke and we are rewarded with a slightly annoying epilogue, which starts off with the words, "There is no mention in history of the battle waged between the Duel Master and the forces of evil." Why isn't there? I don't know, but that's Duel Master, and I like it. The animation is rubbish, the design's weird, but the gameplay and music are spot on, and back in the 16-bit days, that counted for a lot, so give it a look if you haven't already. As always, thanks for watching, and feel free to leave a comment below.